Okay, so I started grading your policy briefs. I have not gotten super far into them. I've graded about 10 of them. And so far they look really good. I haven't seen massive problems yet, but again, I just started grading them. I'm going to hopefully try to finish grading them by the end of next weekend, but there are quite a few of them to go through. And just one other potential concern. So I get my second dose of the COVID vaccine tomorrow. So it is possible that I will not be feeling amazing on Wednesday morning. So basically, what I'm going to do is if I feel like death, I'm just going to send an email and say we don't have class. So you should get the email at least an hour before your class because my first section of this class is at 8. So I would have to let them know before the 8 a.m. class. So please just check your email before Wednesday morning to make sure that I didn't have to cancel at the last minute because I feel like death from the vaccine. I have heard that the symptoms don't kick in for like 24 hours though, and I'm not getting it until 3 o'clock on Tuesday. So it's possible I could feel fine. I just don't know. So just make sure you check your email before class on Wednesday to make sure we've still got it. If I do have to cancel, we'll just do our best to get through the lecture as much as we can. And we might have to finish it up on the following Monday. If that's the case, then I'll just make the quiz be that Monday instead of on Friday, if that makes sense. All right, questions? No questions? All right, let me share the lecture. Okay, so like I said, this week we are talking about gangs. It's a pretty hefty lecture. We're going to talk about quite a few things involving gangs. The first thing we're going to talk about is the police, how the police react to gangs. We're going to talk about how the correctional system reacts to gangs, some of the techniques that they use to try to reduce gang activity, as well as some of the programs that they have in place. And lastly, we're going to talk about some prevention programs. So the reason we're talking about the police's response to gangs is to kind of open the door for these prevention programs. All right. So let's first talk about gang violence. So the effects that gangs have had on crime has always been a major concern for citizens and police alike. In addition to conflicts with other gangs, gang members are involved in a disproportionate amount of nonviolent and violent criminal activity, both on the street and once they're incarcerated. But regarding the former, for instance, and you don't have to sort of scramble to write these stats down, I just kind of want to explain sort of the prevalence. Researchers have found gang-related motives in a third of the homicides in Chicago, in about 50% of the homicides in Los Angeles, and in 70% of cities with 100,000 people or more, the proportion of homicides related to gangs is anywhere between 20 to 40%. So gang members play a considerable role in violence out on the streets. We also see them take part in nonviolent crimes as well, all kinds of things like extortion, so on and so forth, fraud, all kinds of stuff like that, drug dealing. So the other thing that we see about this is that recent analyses of 20 to 30-year trends in the prevalence of gangs in middle to U.S. cities reveal that the presence of gang activity remains unchanged in 2/3 of those jurisdictions. So basically what we're seeing here is that the amount of all of the gang motives involved in all of these homicides, all of the roles that they play in violent and nonviolent crime has not changed considerably in the last 20 to 30 years. So incarcerated, once they're incarcerated, gang members are responsible from anywhere to 1/4 to half of all management problems in prison. So they basically cause a ruckus on the street, and once we incarcerate them, they cause a ruckus in the prison system as well. So they are more likely to be involved in prison violence compared to non-gang members. Even when we are controlling things for like history of violence, other background factors, just being a gang member makes you much more likely statistically to be involved in prison violence. So whenever I get data sets from prisons and jails, they usually have two variables for gang membership. They have confirmed or suspected gang membership. You usually don't want to put those two in the same model together, because when you put two variables that are so correlated in the same model, it kind of messes it up. So you have to run them separately. And no matter how many other variables you put in there that predict prison violence, being a confirmed or a suspected gang member is always significant. So we suspect they're responsible for anywhere between 1/4 to 1/2 of all management problems in prison, but it's likely higher than that because underreporting is pretty rampant, because people don't want to snitch on a gang member. So witnesses are reluctant to come forward. Other inmates don't want to tell a correctional officer that a gang member was involved in something. They don't want to snitch on them. And just like the rest of prison inmates, the majority of gang-affiliated offenders are eventually going to re-enter society, where they're again going to become a concern for public safety. So about 90% of people that are incarcerated are eventually released. Gang members are no different. That number is slightly lower for gang members, but it's still the large majority of gang members in prison are eventually going to be released. It's not that they're all lifers. That's not really the case at all. All right, so let's start talking about policing. So we're going to talk about policing gangs in two separate slides. The first thing we're going to talk about are their tactics, and the second thing we're going to talk about are the social consequences of those tactics. So since the 1980s, more than 360 gang units have been operating nationwide to respond to the perceived and the actual threat caused by gang members. So gang units, you guys are probably all very familiar with this. These are officers that primarily patrol the areas where gang members reside and where they kind of do their dirt. And their goal simply is to sort of gather intelligence and suppress the gang members in those communities. So the three sort of tactics that they officially use the most are intelligence gathering, crime investigation, and suppression. So intelligence gathering refers to the ability of a gang unit to identify who is in which gang and what role they play in the gang. So generally what they're doing is that they are getting out on the streets. They're trying to figure out, who the players are in these gangs. They then create lists or labels. So they will create a list of gang members in those communities. And the list will usually tell them, what gang they are a part of, what sect of that gang they are a part of, because gangs have different kind of sort of organizations within them, like sort of different communities. They're responsible for, different areas of the part or the community in which they reside. And the list will also tell them what role they play. That list is usually shared either statewide. You can add this person that's on a gang member list to your statewide list. Our state list is called GangNet. There's also a federal list as well, and it's shared amongst law enforcement officers. We do not have access to GangNet. You have to be an affiliated officer. But GangNet is really helpful for other officers as well. So if you've ever been pulled over and it takes the officer a really long time to come to your car, that's because they're doing a little background research for you. So if you are on that list, it will pop up to an officer to let you know that you are dealing with someone that is on a gang list. That list is also shared with the local Department of Corrections and the local jails. And the gang units in the jails, which we'll talk about hopefully on Wednesday, also maintain their own lists, and they share them with law enforcement.
What's the name of this system again, real quick?
GangNet. So in our state, once you're on that list, you're on the list for 5 years. And there's a criteria. I used to have the sheet. It's in my office. There's a criteria to be added to the list. But the problem is that criminal behavior is actually not one of those labels. If they can identify that you have a gang-related tattoo, it's things like a gang-related tattoo, a close affiliation with another gang member. It's stuff like that. You have to hit like 2 or 3 of the things on the list, and they can add you to that list. Once you're on the list, you're there for 5 years, and then someone in law enforcement has to revalidate you and get you back on that list 5 years later. So that's part of intelligence gathering. Like I said, they do a lot of interviews. They will examine your tattoos. It's pretty easy. If you've been, these law enforcement officers in the gang unit and the gang units in the jails, which are called security threat groups, but we'll talk a lot more about that later in the week. They are pretty familiar with things that indicate that you're a part of a gang. So things as small as if you've ever seen someone with a 99 tattooed on them, that means that they're a part of the Aryan Brotherhood, because H is the 9th letter of the alphabet and stands for Heil Hitler. So it's just little things like that that they have started. They basically create kind of a list of things that indicate what gang tattoos look like. And so their tattoos kind of tell you what gang they're in, what sect they're in, and what role they play in that gang. So they can garner a lot of information from your tattoos. So that's part of their intelligence gathering, which really helps them with the next one, which is criminal investigation. If they know what gang you're in, what role you play, what sect you're in, they also probably know who your enemies are. So if you or one of your enemies turn up dead, that pretty much narrows the field for who they can investigate. So it helps them solve crimes. So the jail, actually, whenever you are going through intake in our local jail, well, any jail, they ask you a series of questions, usually like 50 or so questions. And they're kind of split up into different sections. And one of the sections is questions specifically about gang membership. And one of the questions they ask you is, do you have any enemies? Because they want to make sure that they're not putting you in the same cell block as an enemy, or in the same cell as an enemy. So law enforcement has access to that as well. That's part of the intelligence gathering. So they know who your enemies are. They had an incident in the jail a couple of years ago. Someone wasn't truthful about who an enemy was, or he just didn't think of this person as an enemy. In the jail, had him living in the same bunk area. So this guy was admitted, and he actually had murdered somebody else's brother, and they put him in the same bunk area as the brother. And the brother saw him being dropped off and kind of turned to the wall, so that the guy wasn't like, whoa, 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 I don't want to be in this unit. And as soon as the officer walked out, he almost killed him. It was a horrible, bloody scene, but this is exactly why we want to know who your enemies are. All right, so the last key tactic is suppression. Basically, the gang units attempt to suppress the gang members with consistent law enforcement presence in the gang neighborhoods. However, most departments will note that their key unofficial tactic is the lock 'em up approach, which is exactly what it sounds like. As many gang members as they can get off the streets, the better. So they incarcerate the gang members they can prove were involved in criminal activity. The less gang members on the street, the smaller the gang problem. So whenever we're talking about gangs, we have to talk about racial disparities. The majority of gang members across the U.S. are minorities. So about 47% of gang members are Latino. About 31% of them are African American, and about 12% are other. The large majority of that 12% are Asian gangs. So about 47% Latino, 31% African American, 12% other, usually Asian. Caucasians only make up about 10%. So these will be your outlaw motorcycle gangs. So if you ever see anybody talking about or writing about OMGs, that stands for outlaw motorcycle gangs, or the Aryan Brotherhood. So,
ma'am, how common are those?
Which ones?
The motorcycle gangs and stuff like that.
I mean, like about 10%. So I would say about 5% are probably Aryan Brotherhood, and about 10% are outlaw motorcycle gangs. It really depends on the state and the city, though. Like in some cities, they're a lot more common.
Oh, so do they kind of like hang out with in the areas where other gangs are, like Chicago and?
Not necessarily. We see a lot of them in the Midwest, kind of. They're really all over, but as far as like their headquarters, I don't know where that is. Most of the gangs in Charleston are in North Charleston, and there is an outlaw motorcycle gang, or like at least 2 sects of them in North Charleston as well. They did have a clubhouse. You guys know where the East Bay Deli is over in North Charleston? They did have a clubhouse there. I think it got shut down though. I think it was raided. If you see a building that was painted all black, that had a suspicious amount of cameras on the outside, that used to be their clubhouse. But they, like I said, most gang members are minorities, and Caucasians only make up about 10%. And I'd say that's probably pretty evenly split between the OMGs and the Aryan Brotherhood, if that answers your question, Jacob. So the other thing to note about this is how we actually define a gang. So this is pretty important for a couple of reasons. The main reason being that a lot of states have passed laws saying that if they can prove that your crime was gang related or motivated by, or like the gang somehow motivated by gang motives, they can add additional time to your sentence. So it depends on the state if they have these laws, and each state defines a gang differently, but they are all very neutral definitions that usually sound something like 3 or more people engaged in criminal activity, either collectively or individually. So the definition is very neutral, very vague. It allows prosecutors wide discretion about how to use that. And unfortunately, this neutral definition has resulted in what some would consider racial profiling, considering the racial disparities of these gangs. So anytime I define or give this neutral definition of a gang, I'm reminded of one of the first times I taught this class at the Citadel. It was the fall semester, and it was either right before or right after Thanksgiving. I noticed a lot of the cadets were showing up in your like little salt and pepper uniform, the really uncomfortable one that zips like all the way up to your chin. And so I asked the students, like, why are you guys all wearing this? And apparently they had gotten into trouble. I don't know if it's still a tradition or if it was like 5 years ago. They would take a turkey and put it on top of like a storm drain or a grate and like set it on fire. And they got in trouble for doing that, and they had to wear those uniforms. And I was like, well, actually, that would fit the definition of a gang, because collectively you guys were engaging in criminal activity. So that's how neutral that definition is. All right, questions about policing gang, or how the gang members are policed. All right, so now what I want to talk about is the social consequences that these tactics have had on the communities. So the first thing that I want to note is that the gang members, or the gang units, will do their sort of tactics in these neighborhoods where the gang members primarily reside. But a question that I get a lot is how many of these people are actually gang members? And it varies neighborhood to neighborhood, but usually it's anywhere between 2 and like 15% of the people that live in these neighborhoods are actually gang members. So just kind of keep that in mind as we start to go through this. So acknowledging the racial and ethnic focus of these strategies is really important because they have created very serious consequences for the individuals involved in gangs, associated with gangs, or just living near gangs. So the young people that live in the disadvantaged communities where the gang units primarily patrol are at a very high risk of experiencing either direct or indirect contact with the police because of these aggressive tactics and the crime control strategies to which they are exposed. So including being the routine subjects of police surveillance and what they consider to be harassment. So furthermore, researchers have found support for what we refer to as the ecological contamination hypothesis. So that this is officers are more likely to use high levels of force and to escalate their use of force when encountering criminal suspects in a high crime neighborhood. So as a result, the tactics used by the gang members, or I'm sorry, the gang units have created very large divisions between law enforcement and the communities in which these gang members reside. So we're going to talk about a study that's really interesting. So this is the Duran study. So Professor Duran is a former gang member, and he did an ethnographic study of the interaction between gang units and the communities in which they patrol in 2 cities. And so an ethnographic study is a qualitative study. It involves immersing yourself in the culture and doing ride-alongs, observations, interviews. That's what an ethnographic study is. So he did ride-alongs with the gang units. He did extensive interviews with the officers in the gang units. And then he did the opposite. He did it with the community as well. So he would like spend a day with a gang member. He would spend a day with somebody that was friends with a gang member. So there are a lot of people that are just friends with gang members, but they don't like ride with them. They aren't actually a part of the gang. And he would spend a day with people that just lived in these communities because they couldn't afford to live anywhere else. He would do interviews, and he really just wanted to understand the interaction between the gang units and the people, these communities where they patrol. So the first thing he talked about was the officer's perspective. So he would say, so how are you doing your intelligence gathering? And they said that they would try to initiate a stop from someone, right? But they have to have probable cause. They can't just stop you for no reason. And so he said, all right, so what are your indicators for stopping someone? And he said that they would look at any number of vehicle ordinances, any traffic violation, really anything that they could find to constitute reasonable suspicion or probable cause that a crime is being committed. So once they stopped them, then they would begin their intelligence gathering. They would ask them, are you a member of a gang? Let me see your tattoos. On several instances, they would pull their shirts up looking at tattoos. So that's how they were kind of doing their intelligence gathering. So then he asked the community members, and so they said more than 95% of the individuals in the communities that he interviewed reported that they had been stopped by the police for a variety of reasons that they were claiming were not criminally predicated. They said that they felt like the officers were simply doing racial profiling. So they said that the common reasons the police gave them for stopping were people matched my description. There were reports of shots fired. It looked like I was wearing gang clothing. We had more than 3 people in the car. They looked suspicious. So as you can imagine, this led to a very confrontational relationship between the police and many of the residents residing in this neighborhood, because the residents believed that the officers were simply using racial profiling. So the other thing that the community said is that the wide array of justifications that the police gave them for stopping them was creating confusion on their part Basically, they said, I don't know what I can do when I leave my house to just go to the grocery store. I don't know what I can do to leave my house to go to work without getting stopped. So they were just sort of experiencing apathy and, just confusion and just frustration. They said, it doesn't matter what we do, they're going to find a reason to stop us. So, like I said, when they do their intelligence gathering and their surveillance, they're creating the lists. And once you're on that list, there's no way to get off that list. So it's very possible for someone to have been a gang member and to have left that life, but if you still have the tattoos, that will keep you on that list every time you get stopped. And what the people in the neighborhood were saying is, once I'm on this list, everything I do is under a microscope. So it's kind of like that surveillance effect that we were talking about a few weeks ago. So if we've got me, who's not a gang member, plus somebody that looks just like me that is a gang member and is on that list, we could be doing the same amount of crime, but they're going to get caught a lot more than I am because they are being watched more closely. And that's what was frustrating to these community members. It's that, they said, I am not a gang member, or I was a gang member, but I don't ride with them anymore. I'm just friends with them, but I'm on this list and every little thing I do is under a microscope. And they were also concerned because there's no due process for this. So criminal behavior is not a requirement to be added to this list. And once you're on that list, you cannot appeal the decision. You can't get yourself taken off this list. So how effective are these techniques? So it would seem that most people stopped by the police were actually gang members, but gang members in most cities are a very small percentage of the people that live in those neighborhoods. So in Los Angeles, only about 4 to 14% of the people that live in these communities join gangs. And in other cities, it's anywhere between 2 and 7%. So basically what they're doing is catching a lot of community members that are not gang members and just pissing them off. The other thing that we're seeing is that these tactics have not led to any meaningful reduction in gang violence since the inception of gang units over 3 decades ago. We have not seen a drop in gang violence. So in summary, the Duran study noted that the aggressive policing of marginalized and oppressed communities was not eliminating crime. Really, all it was doing was leading to a very big division between the people that live there and law enforcement. And when the community in which you're patrolling absolutely hates you, it makes it a lot harder for you to do your job. If anybody's ever been on a ride along or knows anyone in law enforcement, or has even just watched the first 48, anytime there's a shooting or a crime, the first thing law enforcement does is go door to door and ask for witnesses. And if this community hates law enforcement because, twice a week they're stopped and handcuffed and asked questions, or they do that to their daughter or their son, they're not going to help them out. It just makes it a lot harder for them to do their job. So other studies have found that aggressive police tactics have made youth of color feel unwelcome in public spaces and increasingly unwilling to seek assistance from the police. And these experiences have made them feel disillusioned and completely mistrust the police, which, like I said, it makes it harder for the police to do their job. So that's the best law enforcement can hope for, is apathy. At the worst, they're going to these community members can respond with violence, and that's what sometimes happens. There was a really interesting study done about, let's see, I think it was 2016. The researchers examined the Twitter feeds of people that lived in a South Side Chicago neighborhood after law enforcement killed a gang member, and this hashtag CPDK started popping up, which stands for Chicago Police Department Killer. And it was popping up with sort of fantasies of violence towards the police. So basically what we're seeing here is that the gang units are either creating sort of apathy towards the residents, active distrust, or sometimes violence, fantasies of violence. And I mean, the numbers don't lie. We have not seen a reduction in gang violence in 30 years. It has stayed completely the same. So I'm not trying to say that gang units are racist or that they use terrible techniques. I'm merely pointing out that the techniques that they are using are often targeting people that aren't gang members, which only fosters hatred of the police in these gang neighborhoods, and it's a cycle. So if you grow up seeing your father getting pulled out of a police car with a boot on his neck, that's not really going to engender trust towards the police, and it's going to make that child more likely to join a gang. So even though it's a cycle, there has to be a police presence in these neighborhoods. There is a lot of violence in these neighborhoods. They have to do something, and at the moment, this is the best that they have. All right, questions about social consequences before we start talking about potential solutions. All right. So what are some solutions? So the first thing that we have to do is collaborate between researchers and practitioners, because researchers can let law enforcement know if the tactics they're using are not working. Unfortunately, right now, there's little empirical evidence for support for the best method of responding to gangs on the streets, because so far we've just kind of been using gang units. So we're slowly starting to incorporate researchers. We see a lot of problem analysts being hired in police departments that can actively sort of ongoing tell them when things aren't effective or if things are making them worse. And they're starting to try to implement other programs to see what would actually work. So collaboration is important, but unfortunately, there's a little bit of a bad history between the police and academics working together. I mean, I get it. Researchers, we're annoying. We're know-it-alls. A lot of times we just give bad news and then don't give any solutions. And I can attest to this. It literally happened like 3 weeks ago. I'm on the Human Trafficking Task Force, and part of my job is to analyze the effectiveness of the training given to law enforcement. So we have a trainer that is going around and giving training to law enforcement about human trafficking. And myself and Dr. Hefner created a 10-question survey that we give to law enforcement about. So we give law enforcement this survey about what they know about human trafficking before the training, and then they get the same questions after the training, and we see how much they learned from the training. So it's 10 questions, but it winds up being 20 items because a lot of them are like check all that apply. And unfortunately, Dr. Hefner and I had to tell the trainer, hey, so sorry to tell you this, but in 8 out of the 20 items, the officers are getting more questions wrong after the training than before it. So what you're doing is not effective. So as you can imagine, that did not go super well. We had to have multiple other meetings about this. Basically, the woman heard that information from us and just kind of shut down and didn't want to hear anything else from us. But she stuck with us. It's a federal grant, and the grant requires that we give her this information, and she's supposed to make changes based on what we're giving her. So that's kind of what researchers are up against sometimes. You know, we have to deliver bad news. People don't want to hear that bad news. But it's for the best. If the training isn't working, she needs to change what she's doing. And the same should be said for law enforcement. If they are doing something that is not effective, they should try something else. So we've started to see problem analysts being hired in police departments. It's really all about communication. I have rarely had problems working with law enforcement. You just have to kind of, you know, not be snooty about it, and you try to not sound like a know-it-all and try to come up with solutions. So, you know, that's the first start, though, is that you have to analyze the data and see if this is effective. And if it's not, you know, you got to work together to find something that is. So what the research has found so far about ways to improve the gang units. So the first thing that they have to do is integrate community policing tactics. So generally, gang units engage in behavior that is the antithesis to principles of effective community policing. So a lot of the times, the tactics that they use, like we just talked about, isolate them from the community, from other agencies, and sometimes from their own law enforcement agencies. If the whole community sees them doing something really violent. I mean, we just saw, I think, over the weekend, a 20-year-old kid was shot by law enforcement, and we've got protests again. So this isolation leads them to behavior and activities that gets them in trouble with their own agencies, the public, and even prosecutors sometimes. So trying to incorporate or integrate community policing within these gang units needs to be a priority. So we can incorporate other agencies. So we can incorporate other community members as well. So it really shouldn't just be the police in these minority neighborhoods that are trying to spread the message that violence isn't the answer. Really, the whole community needs to be behind the message that would make the community less likely to isolate the police in this manner. So you need to incorporate other agencies that own a piece to the response to gangs. So schools, community groups, neighborhood associations, nonprofit agencies, help them get involved in running the prevention programs with the police to help spread the message that violence isn't the answer. So if the community is working with the police with these prevention programs to spread the word that violence isn't the answer, then law enforcement won't be as isolated in these communities, which would allow for techniques of natural surveillance. So when the police need a confidential informant and when they knock on the door asking if you saw something, someone was murdered 3 doors down, instead of having someone shut the door in their face, they could actually get some information from this person. But this can only work if there's no division between law enforcement and the community. So towards the end of the lecture, we're going to talk about one prevention program in particular that utilizes this strategy right here. So other ways to integrate community policing, they can also, or to improve gang units, they can focus on problem-oriented policing. So they can pull levers, so using other agencies. So for instance, if they know that a suspect is really close with his pastor, they could ask the pastor to talk to that person instead of kicking his door down, pulling him out in handcuffs, and interrogating him. So pulling levers, using the schools, using the community members to help them talk to these people. So focusing on the violent and chronic offenders, instead of trying to arrest as many people as possible, if they could just focus on the really violent ones, that might be more helpful than just doing a giant sweep of people off the street. Or one other way is to have strategic approaches for different gangs. So for instance, in San Diego and Indianapolis, they have a lot of Asian gangs, and the dynamics are slightly different in an Asian gang. The elders have a lot of responsibility and sort of hold the power in Asian gangs, and they really can rein in the youngsters who usually participate in the violence. So what they started doing in San Diego is basically, initially, they were kind of doing crackdowns all the time. So there were illegal gambling operations in massage parlors where the Asian gangs were making a lot of money. And before they tried this new strategy, they were just constantly surveilling these places, constantly doing crackdowns, so on and so forth. And what they started to do was to stop doing that until violence broke out. And when violence broke out, that's when they came in and did like a whole sweep of these gambling organizations and these massage parlors. And basically, the elders got the message that when the gang participates in violence, no one makes any money. So that was one way that they tried to do that. It worked pretty well in San Diego, and they started doing it in Indianapolis. And other ways that other gang units could do this as well is we know the gang members have play a large role in the drug trade. And so sometimes what they'll do, they've got like people out on the streets that are lookouts. They've got people that are selling drugs on the street corners. And instead of constantly cracking down on those people, only crack down when violence erupts. Because the second you do a sweep and you get everybody off that street, they've got 20 people to replace them 5 minutes later. So it's kind of like, if you can spread the message that nobody's going to make any money if you guys are participating in violence, they're going to do their dirt regardless of if the police are watching them or not. So these are all potential solutions. They're kind of in the works right now. We're trying to figure out if this is working better than just the crackdowns and the aggressive tactics that the gang units were using in the past. Research is ongoing with this, but gangs are, a 40, 50-year problem. This is not something that's going to be solved overnight. The best that we can do is try new strategies, run the numbers, and see what works best. All right, questions about this stuff? All right, so hopefully we'll have class on Wednesday. I hope I don't feel awful. If that's the case on Wednesday, what we're going to do is we're going to start talking about the techniques to reduce gang violence in prison, and then we'll switch gears and start talking about 2 different prevention programs. We're going to talk about the GREAT program, which is basically DARE, but for gangs. And we're going to talk about Cure Violence or Ceasefire. It used to be called Ceasefire, but now it's called Cure Violence. Which is this idea that we were just talking about using the community to help the police spread the word that violence isn't the answer. All right, well, if there's nothing else, check your email before class on Wednesday. I'm hoping I'll be able to be well enough to be able to teach. Hopefully I'll see you guys on Wednesday. If not, I'll see you on Friday, but just check your email, all right? Yes, Sam, I can stay.
Good luck, Dr. Hill. I had
Thank you.
45 and I was dead by like 6 o'clock the same day. I didn't feel better yesterday.
Oh my, did you get Moderna or Pfizer?
I had the Pfizer, and like for me, the biggest thing was just like extreme